Wonderful.
Perfect. Okay, so welcome back everyone to this second session of the day. My name is Simone Wies. I'm also with Goethe University Frankfurt. I'm chairing this session. We have a terrific lineup of speakers, and we'll just start with the first talk. We have today's keynote. It's an honor to have Ron Gilson here from Columbia Law School and Stanford Law School. Yeah, he's one of the most impactful legal scholars on corporate law, well known for his work on VC in the US, and today talking about innovation and contract. It's a pleasure to have you. The floor is yours.
I appreciate very much being invited to speak so early on a Wednesday morning in San Francisco. I confess I was a little surprised to be asked to play this role. The conference seems focused on two very well-defined transaction forms, private equity and venture capital. I've written and taught about both, but for some time I've been working with Bob Scott and Chuck Sable, studying a transactional arrangements that seems to be very different from private equity and venture capital, what we call contracting for innovation. What ties all three forms together is that they share an overriding characteristic that drives their attraction and poses a common question. Do the transaction forms generate more innovation? We've seen lots of early work which tries to measure innovation in terms of patent issuances. We're going to be framing this at sort of at the hypothesis formation level, more in terms of anecdote, to frame the questions we want to raise that distinguish private equity and venture capital from the kinds of transactions that we're thinking about here. The important distinction that to us, and maybe I can persuade you to persuade everyone who's listening as well, is the thrust of the analysis follows Frank Knight and John Maynard Keynes. Now we're talking history, right? Shared views of the differences between risk and uncertainty. In this taxonomy, risk describes the circumstances where there are varied outcomes, but each of those, the expectations of those outputs can be assigned a reasonably precise a probability of occurring, with the ability then to generate an expected return calculation. The latter, the uncertainty trade-off in Knight and Keynes framing, is that uncertainty involves circumstances where probabilities aren't possible. One simply doesn't know. The thought that will get developed in this is that the way what I'll suggest about contracting for innovation is radically different than private equity and venture capital, if only by the size of the pieces of formal contract that are associated with it, with the precision of the incentive structure, work that was reflecting the early work in venture capital on the structure, on the careful structure of the incentive components of it. I'm going to suggest, as we start, that what we're beginning to see are a circumstance where the innovation, the critical innovation of the transactional form turns on its capacity to turn uncertainty into risk. That is, we start with the inability often the party's inability to identify likelihood outcomes, likelihood of success. The transaction structure is designed to generate information which moves the effort into from uncertainty and into risk. To step back mostly in time, at the 30,000-foot level, private equity and venture capital have a great deal in common, not the least of which is by now a large body of analysis and empirical studies that address how these forms work and what their characteristics are. Both of them share a common transaction form, which they in turn stole from the real estate and oil and gas transactions. There's typically a limited partnership with a roughly 10-year term that are formed by a general partner in which wealthy individuals and institutions invest. Provides a powerful contractual incentive for the general partner who chooses the investments the LP makes, a carried interest in the LP's performance, usually 20%, but sometimes now up to 30% of the profits, with a small annual management fee. Though given the substantial growth in the size of the limited partnerships, that small management fee multiplied by a couple of $1 billion in the fund begins to be large enough to be of independent significance. The third point is something I've already mentioned. There are carefully structured and powerful incentives by those participating participating in achieving the LP success, but the parallel is equally powerful incentives for the general partner to monitor managers' performance in Paul Milgram and John Roberts' terms, the monitoring intensity principle. The more intense the principle, the more intense the incentive, the more intense the monitoring process have to be. Both PE and VC also share a common ground that supports their performance. Proponents of both justify their high compensation on efficiency grounds. The standard PE story is we buy underperforming public companies, we improve management, we increase leverage, which incentivize management, and generally provide a governance structure that matches incentive and monitoring. In general, VC funds focus on earlier stage efforts, though putting aside the late stage rounds. The GP provides more than cash, experience in growing a company, the ability to share experience, reputation, and connections in a particular industry. The result is that in expectation, in PE and VC, the return doesn't come from resolving uncertainty. It comes from the expectation that investors make high returns that are justified by the level of risk associated with it. What Bob, Chuck, and I are interested in is a very different kind of transaction. We call it contracting for information. It's just that. It's a contract between two parties. There are no special intermediaries. There are no. It's not a fancy financing transaction as we see in both private equity and venture capital. And the easy explanation for it is that in the face of significant uncertainty, the inability to predict, to specify what it is we want to incentivize. The standard if-then formulation is impossible. In the face of uncertainty, trying to define with any precision the goal of the project, the skills that are going to be necessary to accomplish it, how the responsibilities are divided between the parties based on their skill sets would be a self-deluding and self-defeating speculation. And some of the anecdotes that I'll come to will illustrate that. The point is, it makes collaboration between independent parties with very different skill sets indispensable to successfully navigating rapidly changing product markets. Conventional contracting techniques can't manage the effort. That's the focus of where our work is going. This is also an interesting area because it's one in which, equally it's true, I suppose, for private equity and venture capital, the parties in the field and their contract designers have designed a structure which got way out ahead of what the theory was. That is, the people who were actually on the line had a better sense of what they were doing and why they were doing it than the theorists had for some time. The payoff, it's pretty easy to identify the payoff in VC and private equity. There's a process, there's a liquidity event, there's a payout. For contracting for innovation, the structure is designed to move the parties from uncertainty to risk. That is, the payoff comes from generating the kind of information through collaboration of parties with different skill sets that allows, in Keynes and Knight's terms, a more than market risk-adjusted return. The analysis differs in turn from the typical trust-based contracting process, where the models depend on a pre-existing store of trust. Firms which have that store of trust can draw it down in the process of supporting collaboration. The interesting thing, as we'll see with respect to contracting for innovation, is that the contractual structure serves to endogenize trust. Its focus is on creating trust that allows the parties to collaborate in the face of uncertainty. So we start in a setting in which the parties don't know what they're going to make. They have a sense that there's a market opportunity, but the parties don't know what that opportunity is going to be like. They don't know what the market yet will be. They don't have a clue yet about costs because they don't know what they will manufacture or how. And as well, they are not entirely certain about the skill set that other potential collaborators can provide. What is it that we need to put together in order to make this work? Critically, the explicit agreement that is reflected, and there can be rather inches of documents provided, the contract doesn't commit either party to make anything or to buy anything at any price, because the parties don't yet know what the opportunity is, what the market's like, where the potential might be, and the like. Rather, the contract creates a structure that governs the parties' collaboration, a process by which they learn more about what skill sets are necessary. They learn what about potential parties, which potential parties collaborate well. They learn how other parties actually fight when there's a disagreement about which way to go, and the agreement and the collaboration agreement provides the process by which the collaboration is shaped. In effect, the agreement endogenizes trust. In the face of uncertainty, you need to trust the other party. You don't know the other party typically at the outset. Contracting for innovation allows developing that trust. Now, I recognize that this sounds more like a handshake than an arm's length contract. But the contracts for innovation take the form of formal, explicit contracts. They're detailed written documents, committee structures are set up, processes for sharing information and the like are specified. And the length of the collaboration agreement turns out, in our view, to be a focus on where the particular project is along a continuum between uncertainty and risk. A good example, the last 2 years, probably about 2 years ago, a biotech company had developed a potential treatment for a form of prostate cancer that existing techniques simply didn't address. At that point, the uncertainty concerned both the outcome of clinical trials and the ability to market it. In that setting, the collaboration agreement ran about 130 double-spaced pages, because it had moved far enough along that they could be specified. As we'll see in other settings, the collaboration agreement has a common core, but nowhere near the kind of precision that we'll at some points observe. What I want to talk a little bit about now are two industries, automobiles, and then, most importantly, the development of COVID-19, the COVID-19 vaccinations. I'm going to spend less time on automobiles because there's simply more. There's been more going on in that industry than otherwise we've seen, and I'll focus on the development of mechanisms to create autonomous vehicles, the shift to electric cars, and the shift to ride sharing. Focusing for a minute on autonomous cars, in a period of enormous uncertainty, what characterizes the automobile industry now is a wide range of approaches. For 40 years, it was a vertically integrated industry. Suppliers were held to a specified form of contract. It wasn't altered. What we're seeing now, with the expectation of continued speed with which change would take place, we see a wide range of different vehicles for collaboration, and it can be seen most clearly in GM's approach to autonomous vehicles. GM is not a high-tech software producer. Cruise, which is the vehicle that's providing the technology for where GM is going with this, started as a VC backed up startup. GM then acquired Cruise. Cruise then became a joint project, and GM became a supplier of competitors as other car manufacturers invested in Cruise. A similar speed with respect to Waymo. The most recent financing with respect to Cruise valued the technology at somewhere around $40 billion. As yet, there is still not a product. You can get a sense of the industry's perception of the rate of change in the automobile industries from the remarks of the Daimler-Benz CEO just a couple of years ago. The CEO recognized the impact of rapid technological change across all three dimensions on the automobile industry. Put differently, the amount of investment in what were rapidly becoming stranded assets began to be significant when the CEO was asked explicitly, well, where would the returns come from given the remarkable alteration in the industry? He offered a very short answer. The response was, I thought, telling in its imprecision. Maybe robotaxis, he said, maybe a sharing model, maybe something else. And what we see through contracting for innovation, our argument runs, is that an explosion in different forms of transaction approaches when the speed of innovation restricts prediction. How do you contract when you fundamentally don't know where the industry and the technology is going? Stated pretty simply, when innovation-driven uncertainty increases, maybe the easiest way to put it, contract and organization change state. In a stable business environment, contracting patterns are largely stable. Like ice, they have a fixed and observable form. But as innovation heats the business environment, contracting patterns become fluid. Contracting under uncertainty, not risk, requires elements of trust to bridge the gap. And what contracting for innovation does, we get contracting for innovation that ties allows collaboration for people with different skill sets, provides for the building of trust. But notice, critically, there is no formal terms on what the takeout will be. That happens later. The transition is probably best illustrated in the area where it led, which was the collaborative contracts with collaboration within the pharmaceutical industry between biotech, smaller university-tied companies, and large pharmaceutical companies. Two different transactions that Eli Lilly did in the 80s and early 90s illustrated. Lilly was a leading Midwestern-based traditional pharmaceutical company, consistent with the then scientific paradigm and the practice of its competitors. Lilly's expertise was to bring sophisticated chemistry to bear on finding and developing new medications. Both transactions reflect efforts by Lilly to respond to radical technological changes in the industry that were, by the early 1980s, pretty clear in direction. That the future of pharmaceutical research would be based in significant respect on high-powered biology rather than chemistry-based capabilities of Lilly and other pharmaceutical firms. As we'll see, the form begins to take real shape in some of the collaborations that were associated with developing the COVID-19 vaccines. Lilly lacked the biological capabilities that people's belief about where the industry was going would allow them to participate. So for Lilly, the question was, how do they acquire the competency in biology-based science, then typically found only in smaller early-stage firms, typically formed by university-affiliated scientists, that they needed to be able to compete in a post-biology world. Now, it wasn't surprising that Lilly first responded in what was then the still standard practice. It vertically integrated. It sought to bring into Lilly the new biology-based capabilities by acquiring one of the early promising biotech firms. In '86, it acquired a firm called Hybridtech, a San Diego-based biotechnology. There was a industrial district built around San Diego and the Salk Institute. Hybridtech was among the first early biotech firms to go public. They went public at about a $400 million vaccination, which at that point was an awful lot of money. The acquisition proved to be a disaster. The difference in cultures of the two companies, Indiana versus the West Coast, resulted in a culture clash that stemmed from the two companies' disconsolate capabilities and approach to research. In 1990, about 9 years later, Lilly sold Hybridtech for less than $10 million. The technological collaboration through vertical integration had failed badly. I should note, but I won't go into it in more detail now because of time, people learn from this. The Genentech, among probably the most successful biotech firm in the early period, was acquired by a large Swiss pharmaceutical company. The terms of the acquisition required that the headquarters of Genentech remained in Silicon Valley, and the effort later on of the Swiss company trying to freeze out and acquire the rest resulted in very significant litigation between the two parties. Lilly's shift from a terribly unsuccessful effort in vertical integration is illustrated by a 1997 research collaboration and option agreement with a company called Hemisphere Technologies, a relatively small biotech firm privately held, to collaborate and research on new carrier compounds. While this was hardly the only contract for innovation arrangement that Lilly had entered into by this time, it's a useful illustration of how the contractual technique facilitates collaboration in the face of uncertainty. The goal was to use carrier compounds, that is, substances to which a potentially beneficial drug can be attached, to deliver therapeutic proteins to patients orally, carrying them sort of intact through the digestive system, and developing the novel delivery system expected to enhance absorption and efficacy. It required a level of biological science that was well outside of Lilly's existing knowledge. The collaboration process was set out in a formal contract. They conducted a joint research under an annual research plan defined in some detail by procedures, but not by substance. The substance of the research that would be carried out was approved by a joint research steering committee with representatives from both sides, with the goal of identifying compounds with activity in the field. The formal contract did not commit the parties to a particular research plan. Rather, it developed a process by which the research plan would be developed through the parties' collaboration. Each party the lawyers will recognize this, were required to use reasonable efforts to perform the work under the plan, provide reasonable efforts to the research reports to the research steering committee, and run an open research laboratory for the other parties to have access to. The RAC consisted of 3 members from each firm. It met quarterly. They would modify research plans. Importantly, the agreement dictated that all decisions of the RSC about directions in which to push research was required to be unanimous. If the RSC couldn't reach unanimity on any matter, there was then a series of internal appeals. It first went to the senior vice presidents of each firm, whose job it was to resolve the tension. If the senior vice presidents couldn't resolve the tension, the appeal then went to the 2 chief executive officers. Only if the CEOs failed to resolve the disagreement could Lilly terminate its funding. The terms of the formal collaboration establish a process by which the parties learned about each other's skills, but also about each other, and it facilitated the RSC's unanimity that was required for the research to go forward, because otherwise, absence being able to reach an understanding, Lilly could pull the funding. This pattern, and I'm going to finish reasonably quickly. The pattern is now commonplace. The contracts are radically incomplete. They are contracts that tie together parties with different skill sets that they believe will be complementary, but which the outcome of that collaboration is an understanding of the product they're going to produce, the cost structure, and the like. Let me close simply by holding out what I think is a good example of why the contracting for innovation is both different than VC and private equity, where it's designed to focus, to operate in areas not just of high risk, but importantly in areas of significant uncertainty. If we look at the sources of operative vaccines, Pfizer BioNTech reflects a collaboration between a then VC-funded, not quite startup, and Pfizer, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, to be able to fund the research that was necessary the intense research that was necessary over the course of a year to move from the initiation of a collaboration that had some history, a shift in the use of mRNA technology from being a post-infection technique to being a vaccine in the course of 12 months. And I think, as many of you will know, before that point, the fastest vaccine that had been developed was for measles, which took 5 years from initiation to market. This other leading vaccine, Moderna, looks much more like a VC-backed company, but by that point, almost all research was getting put into the public domain, in part because the government was funding it through pre-purchase agreements. Moderna would not have been able to complete its work absent that, and it was in that sense a joint venture between the National Institute of Health and Moderna. I'm going to stop with one prediction about where our work is going. The techniques that are used in a contracting for innovation pattern depends on, in our view, on two different patterns. One is the extent of the uncertainty. How much they know, their ability to identify what they don't know, and the ability to identify a partner and partners to participate in it. The second is the scale of the project, which identifies what techniques will be available to put it together. And where our work is going is the ability to identify and anticipate transaction patterns based on the level of uncertainty as opposed to risk in a project, and as well the scale of the market, which identifies what can essentially what can support a commercial venture. We see it in what I don't have, and I was not able to. I'm not as good as Eric in these techniques, but if you look at a 2x2 grid with the major automobile companies on one side and other participants in the edge of the automobile innovation market, it looks like a game of full page bingo. The experimentation on methods of collaboration, methods of bringing different skill sets into it is going on enormously quickly. And maybe the easiest example with which I'll leave you is that the length of time that Apple has been holding out the potential of building automobiles. They have yet to find partners with whom they're capable, but the process that we're describing is going on throughout the industry. I'll stop there. This is a very different story about collaboration than VC and private equity, and it operates in an area where the relationship, the intensity of the uncertainty as compared to the risk is enormously higher. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Gilson, for this wonderful keynote. So many interesting ideas and thoughts. We still have a little bit of time for maybe a question or two, or any comments or follow-up ideas from the audience, if anyone would like to step up. Simon, do you want to go first? I see the cue in the chat.
Thank you, Simone. Yeah, and thank you, Professor Gilson. Very interesting. I have one question. I have no idea whether it's a good question or not a good question. So
that's uncertainty.
It's not. I was wondering whether this type of contracting relies on trust between the parties, or indeed whether it's a mechanism to kind of obviate the need for trust. In other words, it tries to contract around the handshake and the trust that you might see in certain types of collaborative relationship. And I ask that question partly because I'm interested in whether or not if it has an impact on kind of ownership structure. So does this either rely upon or obviate the need for continuity of individuals in a firm, so you know who you're dealing with, and importantly, the incentives of the individuals who are making decisions in a firm? So does it, for example, mean that these type of contracts are more likely to be successful with, you know, family-owned firms, firms which are intergenerational, firms with entrenched boards or dual-class shares, so that you know who you're dealing with, or is it in fact the opposite, that these contracts actually help you to deal with situations where you don't know who's going to be in charge of making decisions in 2 or 3 years' time?
I've always been, when I've taught corporations, the set of cases that are typically read in close corporations, the odd coincidence is the last name of the plaintiffs and the defendants are often the same. So the notion that family necessarily provides stability is what every family desires, but sometimes it doesn't work, and then it can be pretty ugly. The key to where we've seen contracting for innovation developing and being successful are areas where there is sometimes a pre-existing relationship that is not contractual, but where we'll take Pfizer and BioNTech, they had worked together in this area before, but not on vaccines. What they did very quickly was shift from using the mRNA technique from moving to the place where the infection existed and creating a mechanism by which the cell would itself create the anti-infection phenomenon. In that sense, it was a massively ambitious carrier delivery technique. What they knew about each other was along two particular characteristics. One was they knew they could work together. The other was they knew something about each other's skill sets. There was no budget for the project. That was adjusted going forward. What you see, particularly in biotech, are what we call sort of spiderless webs. That is, a range of companies who, typically in the first stage VC financed, are building up relationships with whom they can then co-partner. But there's no in all of those, there's no commitment about what they're doing. There's no commitment about all there is a basic structure for making those decisions and learning about each other. And companies develop reputations for having the capacity to play well with others.
Thank you. Tobias, you have one last question?
Yeah, thank you so much. So Ron, just one quick question. So talking about the title, Contracting for Innovation, I was wondering if it's really the contract for innovation, because in a sense what you're describing is there is a pretty classical, more or less, startup firm that is VC funded or something like that has the innovation, and then it is only the stage where you take the innovation to a marketable product or you disrupt certain markets where that occurs. because you rightly referred, I think, in your talk to this being an alternative to vertical integration, which doesn't work anymore. But that is sort of at a later stage. So relating it a little bit to our conference, is that an exit strategy that you're describing, or is that really something different?
It's the right question, and I think it's different. That is, we see it is a continuum, but the prostate cancer treatment I described, Japanese big pharma, U.S. biotech, that one was pretty far along the line with the biotech, done by the biotech company, and begins to look more like the circumstance you're describing. The difficulties in that setting depended largely on how they divided up the world. But the circumstances, for example, in Pfizer, in the Pfizer BioNTech, there had been some science done along a different route between the two, but the science basically remained to be done. The science remaining to be done was important, and you saw it in the competition with Moderna. Particularly for vaccines, there are huge first mover advantages. So that adds, in this case, Pfizer and BioNTech got out first with about a 90% efficacy rate. Moderna finished its phase 3 later, and they were waiting to get back the efficacy percentage from the National Institute of Health, and a bunch of people sat in a room because when they got the number, they'd either give up the lease on the office building, or they had a technically in and there are always people stories. The number came through wrong the first time. It came through at 70%. And it wasn't that they had to redo it. It was that it just got transmitted wrong. And they went from it's all over to a 90% return in which they could go forward. But it doesn't. The other thing is it doesn't always work. The AstraZeneca Oxford collaboration ultimately worked, but the internal fighting between the two sides was enormous because AstraZeneca had the tension was whether they would be the vaccine would be priced at a cost only while the pandemic was still going on. They'd still be, if that's the way it had come out, they'd still be fighting about it. But Oxford was less familiar with the pattern than other people were. So the late stage transactions where you're basically you're at the point where you're basically dealing with risk rather than uncertainty will look the way you described it, but there is going to be a continuum.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gilson, again so much for the wonderful keynote and the discussion. We do have a bit of spare time at the end of the session, so maybe we return to some of these